How's everybody doing? Thanks for putting up with this. So what I've done is, I apologize for the delay here. It just took a little while with the logistics to get this pulled together, hauling this stuff over here, and with the help of this great AV crew. So our talk is obviously today, we've got in two parts. The bulk of it's going to be integrating Windows, RHEL with Windows Active Directory. And the second part is a smaller section that I was asked to put on an update on the Samba Clusters product. So I thought it would be fun to kind of put a little, an analogy between, using the acoustic to represent the Windows side of the house and the electric to be RHEL and all the flexibility and versatility. So I thought we'd have a little fun with it, and especially in light of, our time frame. It's, getting towards the end of the week. Everybody's probably burned out, really tired. I know I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I'm sure you guys are too. So let's have a little fun with it. So with that, let's just play a little bit for a second, just to kind of get into the groove. Sound good? I have no signal. Something come loose? Perfect timing, huh? The lights are on, but nobody's home.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any signal yet.
That's got to reset.
Still nothing from the guitar.
That was his fault, not mine. I just make that clear. Okay, let's go. So welcome. So thanks for coming. I'm going to have to jump back and forth here for a little bit till we get done with the guitar section. Okay, so the agenda today, we're going to do a little bit of overview. Fill you in. We're going to use the guitars a little bit for the overview. I thought I'd kind of spice it up and have a little fun with it. We'll go through all the components. We're going to drill down on different technical and non-technical considerations. We're going to go through some of the configurations. All of the pieces I'm going to talk about today, minus the guitars, of course, are part of a reference architecture we just put out. We published in April and put out 2 updates since then based on feedback from people. We'll cover a little bit on futures, and then, we'll also go into a little bit of summary. So our main goals today are really to go through educate, inform, and kind of empower people for making the right decisions. So Webster's goes through and does a definition, and the one that I like is basically uniting pieces together. So when you talk to people about doing integration projects, you have some of the stalwarts on the RHEL, the Linux side that are kind of almost Nazi and want to assimilate over the Microsoft side. So we're not looking at that at all. What we're really looking at is saying, most people looking to do this have large AD environments, and what they want to be able to do is they want help in pulling over those accounts and managing things on the RHEL side. The role model for the reference architecture when it started was initially to do a best practices guideline, and that's how it was approached to me in putting it together. And when I looked at it, I said, I'm sorry, but there's nothing out there like that. There's a lot of little tidbits and bits and pieces for doing specific configurations, but nobody's really done the whole landscape and looked at everything that's out there. So that's what we've tried to do with this paper. So the first question is, of course, why do an integration project to begin with? And probably the vast majority of people really are driven by that first bullet up there, right? You've got multiple user accounts, and you don't want to have accounts on both sides of the house. So you want to leverage your existing Active Directory accounts, use those user accounts, but use them on the RHEL side as well. And that's really what's driving most integration projects. And of course, all the other items are all the great things that we come to know and love about RHEL as well. So when you look at integration options, right, you have basically the choices come down to three things. You can go with third-party options, such as Centrify, Likewise, and Quest. Is Brian here? Brian back here works for Centrify. We were chatting the other day, and I said I would introduce him to make sure, because last year when I did this talk in a stripped-down version, I didn't know Brian was here or anyone from Centrify. So if you have a customer or you have a need to do an integration project and it's not going to be falling into one of these other categories, such as do-it-yourself, and that's our primary focus today, then companies like what Brian does and their company have great alternatives. So when you first start, and this is the same, I looked at the landscape of this to broaden it out for the reference architecture. And at first you look at it and it seems like there's a ton of material out there. But the problem is a lot of the stuff is very narrow in the scope of it and what it covers. So when you get down and look at it, initially it looks kind of simple, right? A lot of people will say, oh, just install Samba and go with that and you're happy, right? Well, anyone who's done this knows that that doesn't always work, right? Every environment's different, and you have to kind of look at all these different options and size it up and go through it. So what we thought was needed really was have a good understanding of the core components, the interactions with those pieces, understand the technical and non-technical considerations, and look at configurations and come up with some recommended configurations and guidelines. We heard this from the field. When I started this last paper, I started it back in September. I spent about 6 months putting this paper together. And it wasn't that building the configurations was the tough part. It was getting consensus among people to agree, what is really the best configuration for different situations. So we went through and outlined, and we narrowed it down to 4 configurations. We're going to go into that a little bit more later. So to liven things up, I thought it'd be kind of fun to kind of use, the acoustic is sort of the window side of the house, right? And we have all the aspects that are involved there. And the electric can be, shadow man for our purposes here today. I don't know if we can put sunglasses on a guitar or work. I don't think that'll work. So I thought we'd use this as an analogy a little bit throughout this for the first part of the talk. Okay? So when you look at Windows, right, consumers' perception is, everything, life is a beach, people jumping for joy, everything to the cloud, right? That's what we see on TV. I have to let everyone catch up to this, right, a little bit. But of course, the reality from the system side is you've got pointy-haired bosses, you've got time constraints, you've got technical issues, and broken promises. So the question is, how do you help the admins out, right? And that's, really what we're trying to do here. So the fundamental question comes down to, how do we integrate, and what's the best approach to take? So using the guitars as an analogy, you can say, if you want to learn guitar, right, a lot of it, and I lobby, it's very much like integrating RHEL with Windows, right? There's a lot of material available. When you first start, when you get looking closer, you're like, wow, there's a lot more to this than I realized. Help, how do I begin? So you start out, you have to look at the components, right? A lot of different materials, different types, acoustic, electric, steel string, nylon string, Fender, Gibson, right? The list goes on and on. So when you're starting, you're like, okay, what do I need to get started? And then other considerations. Okay, what kind of styles of playing, right? I mean, my youngest teenage son is into Norwegian symphonic rock. I mean, every time I look, there's a different variation of metal and all these other variations going on out there. I mean, I've lost track of it over the years, and it constantly changes. So you also have performance aspects, right? Someone who wants to play classical guitar is primarily going to be focused on a solo performance versus a group format, right, doing something like a rock band or a blues band or a jazz trio of some sort. Because you have all the musical aspects that come into play, you know, key, pitch, rhythm, timing, etc. And then tunings. So most people start with their standard frame of reference on the guitars with a standard tuning, but you can change that all up. For some of us gray hairs like me, that process takes a little longer to sink in and realize how to switch that into different tunings. But once you see the light, it's actually really nice and a lot of fun too. So I thought we could look at some examples. I'm going to switch the electric here for a minute, and hopefully we won't make too much noise. So of course, I would be remiss, right, if we didn't consider our trusty mascot. I don't know if we can get this. So look at a few aspects, right, using the guitar. So one aspect is persona. So of course, our beloved mascot, Shadow Man, right, would fit, you know, a piece something like this, right? I think most people know this song. Right? You probably heard that piece before, right? In a lot of B-class movies and things like that, right? So that's kind of one example, right? You could look at the aspect of persona. You know, another element we could look at is rhythm, right? Is everybody familiar with Bo Diddley? So Bo Diddley he was probably the master of the two-chord rhythm, right? So he did something, it sounds sort of like this. Right? So that was a famous rhythm, just using two chords. A lot of variations of that were done, right? The Stones have done it, Clapton's done it. As I noted here, you know, even George Thorogood did a variation of it, you know, Willie and the Hand Jive, right? Which he wasn't even the writer of that piece. So another aspect would be dynamics, right? So that's basically going from, you know, something soft to something loud. So an example might be something like ZZ Top, right? People know LaGrange, right? This song. So something like that, right? Kind of starts out soft and comes in louder. Another aspect would be something such as style. So for this one, a short example would be something kind of a country chicken picking feel. So we changed in style, right? So that's yet another aspect to look at. And the last one that I wanted to show, and this is what kind of ties into our theme, is that we can make different adjustments, right? So remember I was talking about different tunings. You can have standard tuning and alternate tuning. So I can do a slight tuning adjustment here. Sorry, there's no quick way to do this, unfortunately. So check this out. So remember the little piece we did at the beginning, right? We were on the acoustic. So listen what happens when we do this now. We've brought it all the way around. So we took something totally disparate, made some adjustments and some tuning, right, and brought it around. So now we matched what was done on the acoustic side of the house. But here's the cool thing about this. We can still, Shadow Man can still retain his character. So with that same tuning, we just put a little bit of dirt on here. So we still maintain ourselves, right? We haven't given up anything of what we had to begin with. Okay, so with that, so just to recap, right? So we have different aspects looking at, right? Just like when we're doing an integration project. Right, we have all these different components to look at. You know, guitar is just but one example. We could come up with many others, I'm sure, if we really sat down and thought about it. But the key piece is understanding the different components and the aspects. You know, here we looked at aspects here, such as rhythm, style, dynamics. But we can also do the same thing using, on the rel side. So the question is where to start. Well, that's what we do with the reference architecture. So we've gone through and we show you top-down how to deploy, how to configure, and how to build out. Okay, any questions so far? I'm not, right? Okay, so let's dive in now. Let's really drill down into the components, okay? So when you start doing an integration project, right, you look at all the pieces that are out there and survey, and you need to spend some time getting familiar with everything. So we do that in the paper, and we do that with the reference architecture in detail. Now, what I want to do here is, obviously we don't have enough time to go through every single piece. We've done that in the paper. But we're going to look at some of the pieces at a high level, and particularly the most core components. So obviously the first critical piece is going to be Active Directory, right? And the key takeaway is that it really provides customized versions of Kerberos, LDAP, and DNS are in there. I think most people are pretty familiar with it. It's hierarchy-based, you know, full of objects for nodes, trees, domains, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a whole entity in and of itself. And a piece I want to just point out is that in Windows 2008, so Windows Server 2008, it's a role. On the earlier versions, it was a service. Now, the other piece, if you're doing file sharing, then Samba is going to come into play. So Samba itself, right, a lot of people are familiar with it, probably most of us here are. So it combines file and print sharing services. There's two daemons in there, SMBD for the file and print sharing, and then the network BIOS, you know, which provides network neighborhood services on it. On RHEL 6 today, the current version of Samba that's implemented is 3.5. Now, the two protocols, most people call these one and the same. They're technically an evolution of one over the other, so SMB and CIFS. The main difference between SMB was the older one developed by IBM. Microsoft took that, extended it, and made it CIFS. As far as Samba is concerned, it works with both protocols. Winbind is also bundled with the Samba suite. So this provides unified login for your Active Directory accounts. And the three functions that are important to understand with Winbind are the authentication, the ID tracking / name resolution pieces, and the ID mapping itself. So the way, when I built the paper and looked at it, I said, okay, how can we put these in human terms? So I used the terms authentication referred as the who. So the idea is your clients are connecting to an AD box. They're looking to verify who they are, and who they claim to be, so to say. And then we want to know where to find that information. So that's what the ID tracking piece is doing. And then ID mapping is, how do I refer to you? What do I call you on one side of the house, on the Active Directory side, versus the RHEL side? So as a diagram, I built this with some help from some folks in engineering. We tried to come up, put our heads together, and this is the graphic that we built to try to represent these pieces. So the blue obviously represents the auth pieces. It's going through the PAM Winbind libraries, and then Kerberos for the encryption. ID tracking goes down also through the NSS Winbind libraries. And then the back ends vary depending on what you configure. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. In the paper, we've got quite a lot of A/B comparisons, the pros and the cons of each of these back ends. So just keep in mind that this is for file sharing configurations. So I said there's quite a number of backends available. There's other ones coming down the pipe later. It's kind of a changing landscape. Now, the other thing I did with the paper was I came up with these terms. I said, well, how can we classify these? There's some categories to make it easier to kind of get your handle around it. So I came up with these terms: allocating, which is basically a local, the data is stored locally on the server, the mappings; algorithmic, and then the assigned. So that's how we can look at all this landscape of options and come up with simple buckets to classify them as. SSSD. Has everybody here worked with SSSD? Maybe I should ask the other, who hasn't worked with SSSD? Okay, oh good, well that's a fair number. So SSSD is playing an ever more important role on the RHEL side. So there's a client piece, there's a server piece. For interoperability with Windows, we're looking mostly at just the client piece today. Now what's happening is our strategy is moving. So we have products some of you've probably heard called IPA. So we've sort of renamed that recently to IDM for RHEL. And it's really based on the IPA product. So what you have with this is you've got the capability using SSSD can talk to IPA, it can talk to different authentication sources and providers, as well as Active Directory. So Active Directory is fairly limited in terms of what type of providers it can talk to, whereas IPA is looking at expanding that and adding more to it. So you're going to see more and more in the future with SSSD as it rolls out. Yeah, and as I've noted here, there's other capabilities which are nice. It does, offload servers. There's performance improvements on it. It can cache, authenticate the credentials that have been authenticated. And of course, we have Kerberos. And I think most people are well acquainted with Kerberos in one form or fashion. The main point I want to make here is that from an integration perspective, your Active Directory environment, the servers that you're pointing to there, that's going to be your key distribution center, your KDC. And the other thing that's really important that we recommend for people doing interoperability projects is install the KRB5 workstation. It's a simple kit to install. And then that way, if you think you have a problem that's Kerberos related, you can do a simple kinit and klist to verify whether the credentials are working or not. All right, so let's step back now. Let's look at some of the considerations. We'll start with the non-technical. So this is the simplest one to look at. Of course, we blow this out more in the reference architecture itself. The one that's probably the most important on this list is organizational alignment. So we hear this from the field frequently where people say, you know, the problem is that, you know, the AD side of the house is managed by a different group than is doing on the REL side of the house. And when you're doing an interoperability project, right, you might have different organizations. So the role model that I've typically used in looking at that and building the paper and in talking to people is you've got a large AD environment, and what's happened is now this organization that manages that has got this 10, 15, 20 REL boxes out there. Kind of, you call them those rogue engineers out there, right? They just had to go out there and buy REL and put it out there, and the AD guys are like, well, how do we manage this? There's something else to learn, right? Because remember, they're all stressed out, right, in that earlier slide there from the pointy-haired boss and the time constraints. So that's sort of the model looking at. So when you're doing this, you may be faced with that. How do I work with these people and do that? So that can be a challenge, you know, and the recommendation, of course, is, you know, you've got to break the barriers, you got to, you know, build the bridges. So engage those people early on in your project deployment. So let's go through some of the technical pieces. The first one, of course, is file sharing. Do you need file sharing, right? Not everybody needs it. So if you're going to do file sharing today for a do-it-yourself solution, you know what we're talking about, you're going to have to go with using a Samba-based solution. Now, if you don't need file sharing, you can still use Samba. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's perfectly fine. You can install it, use Winbind, and just never use the file sharing capabilities of it. The other thing I want to say about file sharing, which is often comes up in a confusing source of contention among discussions, is where are the file shares located? Because Samba has both a client and a server piece. So most situations, what you're looking at, you're taking those rogue REL boxes out there and integrating them. The file shares are going to be in the AD environment already. So you're going to use existing shares. But there's no reason why those engineers with the REL boxes can't have their own localized file shares as well. So it's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you need to be clear and make the distinction when you're rolling things out. And I've encountered this many a time in discussions where people are like circular arguments, and they come back and say, well, wait a minute, where are the file shares located here? Of course, most people are interested in having login access. So for REL, you know, CLI and the Graphical Display Manager login access, you know, the issue it comes down to is you're going to need the account set up, obviously, to make the integration happen. So, and this is the whole point driving that first bullet way back when we were looking at. You're saying, I don't want to maintain accounts in the Active Directory side as well as the REL side. I want to just use what's already in the AD side and log into my box using those credentials and those accounts to do it. Now, here's an area, the RFC 2307, a lot of people probably heard about it. Some people call it schema extensions or schema updates. You have to kind of be careful with that because some people are really sensitive to that terminology. Basically, RFC 2307 is a spec that defines how to extend Unix attributes using LDAP. And all that means, in plain, you know, mere mortal English, is that it gives you more control. You can specify on the Active Directory side the Unix home directory and shell. So that's all it does. When you enable, and this is done through the identity management for Unix role, so when you enable that, you'll get a new tab on your Unix accounts. So when you, or excuse me, in your AD accounts, there'll be a tab on there that says Unix IDs. You can go in there and specify the information. And I've just listed here on these bullets that, you know, historically the name has changed. It was a service and it was an add-on product, but today, for Windows Server 2008 R2, it's a role. You just go in there, you click on it, you enable it, and you're done. It's a piece of cake to set up. The most important thing here that I should also point out is that highlighted bullet here about organizational policy. Because in many environments, and we hear this from the field frequently, where they say, we've got environments where nobody can touch the schemas. They are what they are, and there's no changing those whatsoever. So if you have a customer, you have a situation like that, that's going to dictate what options for configurations that you can select and choose. So we've built that in our list of recommended configurations, and we're going to come to that in a little bit. So another area is enumeration. So the behavior of Winbind by default is when your clients connect in, they first do a listing of all the users that are out there. Well, obviously, if you've got tens and tens of thousands of users, that could take some time. So it's a simple enough directive. You can turn it off within the snb.conf file. The general number we've been using is 20,000. It's sort of just a number we've pulled among people, and it seems to be consistent. Everybody seems to agree. If you got that many users, you may want to turn it off. And likewise, ldap has somewhat of a sort of similarity to it as well, called ldap referrals. A lot of folks I talk to aren't familiar with it. But basically what happens, right, ldap is designed to scale out. So it also works with objects. And then pieces of the ldap directory structure can move across multiple domain controllers within your AD environment. The problem is that if a client goes to a controller and it doesn't have the information, all the information, it also can slow down the performance as well. So it's a simple enough thing to turn off from the SSSD side. You can turn it on or turn it off. The caveat is that you have to have environments that are not doing partial replication of the objects in the ldap directory structure. All right, so I thought now let's look at the configurations. So we've basically got 4 recommended configurations. This is what we've done in the paper. So the way the paper is structured, there's background and everything. We do a lot of comparisons of everything. We have a decision tree, and it slots you to one of these 4 configurations. So I thought we'll introduce them a little bit and kind of talk to them at a little bit of a high level. So the first 2 configurations are Samba-based and also using Winbind. The main distinction is that the first configuration is what we call this a template-driven configuration. So this is for clients that cannot do the schema updates. So remember we're talking about, can you enable the RFC 2307, your Unix ID attributes? Those clients that can't do it, that's the configuration they want to use. So it's basically template-driven. They're not going to have that extensions done, the ldap extensions done on the AD. If they can do that and can enable the identity management for Unix piece, then they go with the customized configuration. And this is probably what most people that I've spoken to at least seem to go with this. So those first 2 provide file sharing and login access. Now, the 3rd and the 4th configurations have no file sharing capabilities, right? So these are just straight login access. So the 3rd one is based on SSSD. And we call this the enhanced one because this gives you all the features of SSSD client. So you've got the authentication, the advanced authentication and caching of clients, reduces performance on the servers, improves performance on the servers, reduces the load on them, and so forth. The last config is what some people call the native Kerberos ldap configuration, or I've even heard the term pure sometimes. We're calling it the legacy. The services group was adamant when we were putting this paper together, and they said, please, let's discourage people from using this. But there are people that do want to do this. They don't want to go in the Samba environments. They're not interested in that. They don't care about file sharing. And maybe they're just not ready yet to try experimenting or trying out SSSD. So this is the default one for people that fit that category. So I've got graphics for these, just high level. Basically what we've done in building these out is we're using the central services, so NTP, DNS, we're outside of AD. So this would be the typical configuration for that with Samba. This is our template-driven configuration. Underneath the hood, basically very similar to the diagram we looked at, that high-level diagram earlier, the same one. What's changed is that the backends here we're using is the IDmap RID configuration. So what's happening is the PAM Winbind libraries are handling the authentication pieces, and then also there's a Winbind library for the name service switch, right? So NSS is what's going out and saying, okay, where do I go find this information? Tell me where to go. And then once it knows where to go, it goes out with the ID mapping is using the backend, so the RID backend. Second configuration, virtually identical. The only thing we've changed is the backend changes, use the AD one. So again, the difference being, first configuration is for customers and client situations that can't modify the Active Directory schema structure whatsoever. This one is for the customers that can. Third configuration, very similar. And I might point out here that in all these configurations, we've moved the centralized services. These are outside of Active Directory. There's no reason those can't be brought in, right? You could have that within your AD environment. We just chose for, our purposes in the lab to put them out. But there's no reason why you can't do that. So in this configuration, drilling down slightly, auth is done basically through PAM SSSD modules, and likewise there's an NSS, so the name service switch SSSD module as well that handles the ID tracking. You notice there's no ID mapping in here because we're not doing file sharing. And last, our legacy configuration. And here what you'll notice is that the Kerberos and ldap pieces are distinct from one another, right? They're not going through and wrapped around with SSSD or through Samba and the Winbind pieces. I think this area, I'll be honest with you, I think the auth areas and ID tracking idea is the most confusing aspect of this whole area by far. I talk to people and a lot of people just no clue. And so identity management and the whole authentication area is an area that we tried to tackle this and try to make this a little bit easier. And you can see it in the paper. We go through and provide more background and detail on this in the reference architecture itself. But I thought it was important to have diagrams that could kind of tackle this at a more simpler level to give you a visual. I know if you're a visual thinker like me, this is invaluable. And just trying to keep this all squared away. Okay? So I thought let's look at just a few of the futures, things that are going on. So there's a new, in the Winbind space, there's a new backend that's making its way in, this IDmap auto read. So it's very similar, like the first configuration used IDmap read, right? The auto read configuration has the advantage that it automatically takes care of allocating the domain ranges for you. So it specified that. So I didn't put that in here, but it's in the paper. You can see the examples of each of these. We have, of course, all the details, all the config files, and we explain what needs to be set. So on the RID configuration, you have to manually specify these ranges of where you want them to be. SSSD is more and more important as time goes on. It's just a critical piece, and we're going to see more and more work and activity going on that. It's slotted for 6.4 to have full domain trust support. So what that means is your AD environment here, your clients can talk to the AD environment. They can talk to the IDM, the IPA environment, and there'll be trust support through both of those. This is probably the hottest area, I think, that comes up in discussions on internal lists. And in the long term, what we're probably likely to see, and we've had discussions with engineering, I've had several mail threads on this, is in the long run, we see this as being a full-featured alternative to Winbind. So if you don't want to use Samba or Winbind, you'll be able to do everything through SSSD in the long run. Can't tell you a roadmap or time frame for that. We have no idea. Those discussions are just starting. It has to go upstream and milk its way down. But I suspect this is going to happen in the long run. And then lastly, just RHEL 7, of course, high focus still on interoperability. A lot of people in the field are saying, hey, this is great. A lot of the stuff is sort of low level. Can you, kind of make it a little easier for us? So you're going to see more activity in this space, coming ahead. Okay, so at that point, does anybody have any questions? A question?
I have a question. Between the four models, you have to have the local user information on the Linux servers. I think in the Samba models, you were saying it's calculated from AD, UID, and GID.
Right. So what happens is, so you're using existing accounts that are in the AD environment on there. So you can have localized accounts, but that defeats the purpose, right?
Right.
Now, the way the IDs are mapped are in those three categories that we built on there. So the in fact, I think right here, maybe we glossed over it. So you're talking about the first configuration with the RID.
I'm talking about, I'm really interested in the third and fourth.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Can we have that with the UID and GID being computed from AD somehow?
Absolutely. All of these do that.
Okay.
They all do that. If you, the key point is, and last year I did a talk in this space. We used the default Samba configuration for the first reference architecture, and then I blew it out and expanded to other options on there. that by default, if you do the default Samba installation and configure integration, it's going to use the local TDB database. That does not scale out across multiple rel boxes. So what it means is, if I have an account in AD and I go to one box and log in, I'm not guaranteed I go to the other rel box that the IDs will map. I have in the back of the slides, so this will get posted up, you better download it. I actually have a sample of logins of each of these. You can see the IDs, and in the paper that has how I map them out in the lab as well. Does that answer the question?
Yes, just one other question. It requires IMU. What does that mean?
That's the identity management for Unix. So that's the RFC 2307, the Unix ID attributes.
You have to put that in AD. You have to put that in AD.
It's just a server, it's just a role, you enable it, and in the reference architecture, I have an appendix in the back that tells you how to configure that as well as your AD environment from scratch.
Do you define the UID and GID there?
Yeah, I actually have a table. Now, I did this as lab config. I did them as pairs, and there's actually a graphic of that models all that out as well. You'll see how we did. I used virtual machines and pairings, and they verified that the IDs were consistent across them. You'll see that. But it's in the slides here. I actually did snippets of those. They're just, it's at the end of it. So, I'm sorry.
Just to extend on that, in an NIS environment with a decade's worth of UID and GID history, you get configuration to import all that. You're saying that AD is going to take control over creating.
So the user, can you explain more about where the accounts are still in AD, right?
No, well, you have NIS accounts on the Unix side.
Okay.
Right? Users happily working on that side.
But that's outside of AD, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Right.
So can configuration to support those existing UID, GIDs?
There are, what I'll say is there are configure options that you can do using NIS. Most people stay away from it because of the security aspects, right? Because most of the time it's not using Kerberos, so the connections are not encrypted on there. So in terms of importing them in, not sure, I'll be honest with you, I haven't done it. I don't know people have moved stuff over. I mean, usually everything's over.
You don't want to create all new UIDs for the existing things.
Right. You'd probably have to script it and load those in using PowerShell is my guess. That's probably the answer. I don't know, maybe somebody here knows better.
So isn't it possible to use NSS switch to go first like local password, then your NIS server, and then
Yes.
Winbind?
Yes.
Maybe that's a combination, but
Yes, you could.
Your account to two different locations, obviously.
Right. And then you have to decide, okay, am I talking to the right account at that point in time? Then you have a problem there that results.
Sunset using this, but you don't want to have to reassign all those UIDs.
Right. I mean, it's a great question because you might have thousands and thousands, huge number of accounts, right? But I'm guessing the answer is you're probably going to have to go with some sort of PowerShell import, move things over and have it recreate the accounts there and automate it for you to do it.
The IMU also, in addition to your home and shell, has UID information.
Right, all it does is it extends. When you go in and you look at a user and you open it up, you get a new tab in there, and you can specify the user ID that you want to be known as, a group ID, the home shell, the home directory, as well as the shell that you want to use. When you don't have that enabled, then you're restricted into what you can use. It's all, again, this is in the reference architecture, because I walk you through each of these configurations top down and building them out. Was there another question? Or? Oh, in the back.
Is there any way to tie a specific any group to like a pseudo-order? So you can have any group of Unix pseudo-orders that would tie back to a local pseudo profile, for example? Unix signer? Any easy way of doing that?
None that I know of. I know a lot of people will do is in the AD side, they will make, well, in fact, I did it in the reference architecture. I made Unix users group, and I made the accounts under that to keep it separate. So most people do that. They'll specify them separate. But I'm not, to be honest with you, I don't know in terms of having higher level access to do that. It seems doable. The question's probably, do you want to do that? Not sure. It's a good question. We could talk about it offline and kind of explore it more if you want. Never had anyone ask about that before.
So I've done something like that in hand. So you can do that. It's kind of tricky. The perfect example is we have different groups of people. We're a large corporation.
Right. Right.
So if I
Right.
can just create a group in AD, those guys that's in the Backend group have super, only command they can run is command.
It sounds like you could do it. I mean, it's just a question of how to do it. I think that you have to work the mechanics.
We kind of run configuration too. We can have like we have a Windows security group of like IT users, and then you can add that like to the sudoers file with percent name of the group. So.
And do that, and it should work the same. So you should be able to. No, you might want to talk. You two guys might want to talk a little bit. You might have some good information to help share with them. Okay. Another question.
Where is this architecture document you mentioned?
Well, the links are on here. Let me go back here. You can go to basically here to the link. So it's on redhat.com, right? So our team, I didn't really do honor for our team, but we're part of a team. There's 8 of us in the group. And what we do is we build stack solutions inside the lab, and we write up these very detailed papers on how to do it. So they're like cookbooks. And until it was only about 3 months ago or so, 4 months, it was put out on redhat.com. It used to be you could only go through the customer portal or some of the internal sites to do it, which wouldn't do you any good. But now it's publicly available. You can Google search these and find them. They're showing up now in searches. And we're encouraged. It's a good thing. It should be out there. We target them primarily to the field, to customers, and then partners. But anybody can download them, pull them down. And if you have comments, if you find errata or something like that, we actually have an email link that's in there on the second page you can use. I would highly encourage you, if you haven't looked at it, look at the site and browse through. Again, they're also on the customer portal as well.
Do you have an idea what, there isn't any exceptions to the queue about IDmap or now?
That's a great question. And I'll be honest with you, that engineering team, I work with those guys all the time because we're sort of like kissing cousins here and doing interoperability in them. And when I started this paper originally, we thought we were going to doing an IDM type solution as one of these options, but some changes were made in the short term with SSSD, so we ended up not doing that. But in the longer run, it will come back around again. I think you're going to see that. That is on the list to do, and it very well may be me actually building that reference architecture. I wouldn't be surprised. So you'll see that. That's the kind of feedback that we're looking for. So I don't know, did you guys go to our booth down in the pavilion, the reference architecture booth? I don't know if you had a chance to see it or not. I think my legs are still killing me from standing all that time there. We had in your backpacks is a card that was in there. There was a whole bunch of material in there, but one of them was for our team. This is the kind of feedback we're trying to get from people so we can take it up the management chain and see. If you have that request or you'd like to see that, chances are there's quite a few other people out there that want the same thing. So we'd love to hear it and get that feedback. Was there somebody else? Okay. All right. So let's roll forward. I guess the last piece, let me just wrap up. Sorry, I got waylaid by the technical question. So basically, obviously it comes down to picking the best configuration for your environment, what your needs are. I think that's pretty intuitive. But the thing I want to point out is that you can do hybrid configurations. So that third configuration using SSSD has no file sharing capabilities. There's no reason why you couldn't also install Samba and use Winbind so you can have file sharing with it. We did not do that in the paper and didn't talk about it here because we didn't think there was that many customers that really want to do that. Usually if you want a file sharing solution, you're going to just go with Samba anyway. But there's no reason why you can't invent your own wheel, so to say, or a hybrid and do that. Perfectly fine. I want to reiterate that third-party products, right, with Brian and company, Centrify, perfectly fine. They might be a better solution for some situations, some customers. It's really important to prototype and test this stuff out. And I can tell you that most of the problems I've seen, and again, I'm working in the lab, right? So my environment's certainly more limited than what most people have. But clearly, the number one problem I see is DNS. It's just not resolving right. And it could be as simple as the networks file and the sysconfig networks file, so you don't have a fully qualified host name on your RHEL system, or maybe an A record is missing on Active Directory. So we go through that. The paper covers all of those things. Usually that's the piece that I find the biggest, causing the most problem. And sometimes it manifests itself in a different way. So I've seen Kerberos issues. You're in Kerberos, right? You're like, well, this worked yesterday. I had no problem. And suddenly it's because of a DNS issue underneath. So just be aware of that and sensitive to it. And we tried to outline that in the paper as well. OK, so with that. So I've got about 10 slides here to give you an update on Samba clusters. Is anybody doing anything in this space? Are you guys familiar with CTDB in the project? It's OK. You could say, no, that's why we're here, to learn about it. That's a great answer. OK. So Samba Clusters is all based on the CTDB project that's upstream. It's coming out now with RHEL. It's officially in full support with RHEL 6.2. So I've got about 10 slides or so to kind of fill you in. We are going to put a new reference architecture that will tell you how to deploy this and build that out. So I'm actually doing that as we speak. So as I said, it's in full support now officially with 6.2. Just a caveat. I have found some material on the web that's a little, it's confusing. It says it's not supported. We're trying to sort that out and get that messaging fixed. So if you see something that says it isn't, just be known that technically it is full support as of engineering. It has the stamp on there. We just haven't got all the outside material in a couple places sorted out and updated to sync with it. So basically, the Samba clusters, or CTDB, as a lot of people refer to, is providing a highly available file sharing that's scalable. All right? You're going to have true active access to a common file sharing or file store underneath. And the performance scales out. So it's using GFS2. We're going to talk about it a little bit more here in a second. One caveat is that there's a limit currently of 4 nodes to the cluster. Now, it may change in time. I suspect it will. But currently, that's what's fully supported. So your requirements. You need the high availability add-on, right? HA add-ons is our clustering product. Includes Conga, that's the suite of Ricky and Lucy. The CCS is a command line tool for that. Resilient storage add-on, which includes clustered LVM, CTDB, as well as GFS2. So what that means is, from a licensing perspective, right, you have the additional entitlements for this to do it. Your storage is common. It can be fiber channel or SCSI is fine. It just needs to be shared common storage. And you need public networks as well as private for your cluster interconnect. So I said, so CTDB basically is a clusterized version of TDB. So we were talking a short while ago about Samba. The default installation uses the TDB database, right? So that's a localized. This is the clusterized version of that. So CTDB has some processes that run. So there's some daemons that talk to each other, handle the messaging and recovery. And we support it with GFS2. Now, if you go outside and you look upstream, what you'll find is there's other file systems supported. I think the last time I looked, OCFS2 was supported. There may be 1 or 2 others. But from the RHEL side, we're just supporting GFS2. So you create 2 CLVM volumes. So one is for CTDB itself. It basically keeps a lock file in there. It's just the status of the cluster nodes, what's going on at any point in time. And then you set up your file share. So you size that for whatever size your data needs are. And both are, of course, GFS2. So I built this graphic to help simplify and view this. And this will be going into the reference architecture itself as well. So on startup, basically, the cluster manager starts. So CMAN starts all the cluster services. Then you start up the CLVMD, right, for cluster volume. GFS2, so you mount the volumes. And then if you're doing interoperability with Windows AD, you would set up Winbind will start. If you're not doing interoperability, you don't have to enable that. Samba starts, and then your share starts. So this is the sequence of going up, and the process is reversed going down. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, graphically, if anyone's looked at, there's a reference architecture I did last year on high availability web services. This graphic probably looks fairly similar, except it doesn't have the Lucy interface on your management station. So your client's basically connecting through a public network. The cluster nodes are connected over a public right, for your share access coming in remotely, as well as a private cluster interconnect, so CIs there. We're using bonded interfaces for redundancy on everything. And then access to your common storage, so basically the CTDB database, volume, as well as the data volume for your file share. So in the next couple slides, I just mapped out quickly, just so you get an idea what's involved in setting this up, right? So you deploy your cluster nodes. Obviously, you want to configure the networks. Bonding is preferable, firewall ports. Create the cluster. Now, you're using CCS for all of this. So what happens is there's sort of a distinction. So CTDB is not really tightly integrated with the cluster product. If you're familiar with our HA product, right, you have this thing called Resource Group Manager, RG Manager, and you create services. And just like we had a stack in that last diagram, you had a stack of services and dependencies on there. What happens here is CTDB is really sitting on top of the HA cluster. So there's no Resource Group Manager involved in it. That could change in time. I can't promise that. I don't know for sure. But let's talk about that in the future, maybe making more tightly integrated. But for now, all you need to know is that CTDB really manages up above everything. So build out your cluster. Pretty straightforward. It's pretty quick. You just use CCS. Configure your storage, so provision it. Set up multipathing, your CLVM volumes that we talked about. Format the volumes. And then you configure CTDB, and it's pretty easy. There's just 3 files, and they're here on this next slide. So there's a CTDB file itself, and the first 2 directives just point to the 2 files underneath. Your nodes files, just the IP addresses of your cluster interconnect. And then the public addresses is pretty self-explanatory. You put in the location of your recovery lock volume, so that's just pointing to the lock file that's on the CTDB volume itself. If you want CTDB, now by default, it will manage Samba and Winbind if it's used. That's the default behavior. If you don't want to have CTDB started, you want to manually do it yourself, I could see a situation where maybe you want to have everything up, but not have the sharing actually turned on yet, maybe delayed for some reason, so maybe you would script that. You could just turn it off here, and then it's up to you to start those services by hand. So next, to finish up the deployment, basically you set up Samba, you install the kits, you create the share, start the service up, and the rest of the steps are basically just like that stack. So what we do, we start up Cluster Manager first, then we do CLVM daemon, we mount the volumes, and then we start up CTDB, which will start Samba and or Winbind as well. And you can vary, just do a CIFS mount to it from Unix boxes, any Linux box, or do an SMB client. Likewise, Windows boxes can mount it as a drive. So this is an extension of the other systems diagram. It's just showing that if we did AD integration as well, then we would just have the AD side coming over on the public network. So just to kind of wrap this all up a little bit. So again, just to reiterate. So CTDB, the Clustered Samba project, is going to provide highly available and scalable file shares. Right? You are restricted to 4 nodes. Remember the add-ons that are needed. You need HA add-on. You need resilient storage add-on. So remember the entitlements. There's more involved in that. Default behavior is CTDB will manage the Samba and the Winbind pieces. And if you want to do AD integration, you have the option of using some of the other backends that we talked about in the other half of the talk, right? Such as the RID or the AD. And so we have a new architecture that's coming out. So if you know people are interested in this, keep an eye out for it. We'll be publishing this out probably next month. That's the plan. And just to reiterate back to your question, where can I find these things? I highly encourage you to take a look at it. We have a lot of people in the group doing really great stuff. Our team is split across. We have roughly 3 people now doing just cloud projects and cloud reference architectures. We have 2 people doing rev work. We're doing cluster work now. I'm doing primarily platform work. So we're covering the gamut, and we hear from people that new ideas, and we want that. We need to get that information from people. What I consistently find with our group, and we found this in the booths, about half the people have never even heard of the reference architecture work, and the other half are like, oh yeah, I've heard about it, love it, great stuff. So if you're not familiar with it, browse around and look at it. And also don't forget the customer portal, right? There's other material directly related to this, particularly with the other half of our talk with interoperability and AD. There's a lot of K-base articles there as well. And with that, that's about it. Just a lot of people at work to help us build these papers out, and I just want to thank them. Any questions on the clustered Samba piece? Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I try to make it as concise as possible for folks. So, okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and thanks for putting up.